Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar from the National Center for Rural Road Safety. Today's webinar will be on traffic safety culture messaging. We're going to get started right now by closing out some of these polls. And it looks like where people are joining us from today, we have about 18% from the Northeast, about 20% from the Southeast, 24% from the Midwest, 29% from Western U.S., about 8% from other. As far as how many people are joining us from your location, as Nick said earlier, it does look like we have great social distancing going on, and about 96% of you are joining us by yourselves. As far as who is joining us, we have about 12% from federal DOT. We have about 26% from state DOTs, about 13% from local transportation departments, about 11% from state highway safety offices, about 1% from tribal governments, 1% from public lands agencies, 9% from other federal, state, or local government agencies, about 2% from local technical assistance programs, 2% from first responders, and about 4% from universities, and then 12% consultants and 7% other. And most of you are joining us today by computer only, although there are about 20% of you joining us by computer and phone. We will go over some instructions here in a second, just in case you do have some issues. And so let me move us over to that new screen. So a few webinar logistics for everyone. This webinar will be an hour and a half long. It is being recorded and will be archived on our website. For quality of the recording, as most of you know, the phone lines have been muted. Because of this, we would ask you to go ahead and put any questions that you may have in the chat pod on the left-hand side. When we stop for the question and answer periods, of which there will be 3 today, I will read those questions out loud to our presenter. You may put those questions in there at any time. That way, if you do have a question in slide 2, for instance, you could put it there instead of waiting for the question and answer period. This will just allow us to move through it a little bit quicker. I would also mention that because if you are listening on the phone, we would also ask you to mute your computer speakers, otherwise you will hear some feedback. If you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll also see 4 arrow keys that press outward. If you press on that button, it will make the PowerPoint screen itself full screen and get rid of some of the extraneous information on the outside. You may want to do this when we show you the videos. It will make them a little bit bigger for you. There is also in the bottom left-hand corner a handout pod, and you may download the PDF version of today's PowerPoint slides from there. I also want to mention that we do have 2 sets of follow-up surveys that come out. The first one will be sent directly following today's webinar. You can now see the link for that on the screen. This is how you would go about requesting certificates of completion in CEUs. Surveys close 2 weeks after the webinar. It takes us approximately 4 to 6 weeks after that to create the certificates because we do make them manually. You can return CEU forms, which will also be sent out with the certificates, to continuinged@montana.edu and not the Safety Center. Those are provided to a different department within Montana State University who essentially makes you a student to be able to provide those more formal continuing education units. Due to that, you may request a verification of completion form. On your screen now, you'll see what that CEU registration form looks like in the top left. In the bottom right, you'll see what a verification of completion form looks like. If you have registered for more than just the one CEU classes with us, all of them will show up in that verification of completion. That would include any of the webinars you may have turned in that form for, as well as either of our summits that we have already had. I do want to mention as well that because most people are working from home right now, we may run into some audio and visual issues that we normally would not run into. So I do want to point out as well that in the top left-hand corner of your screen is the 866 number with which we are using. If you do lose the audio through your computer, it would be safe to call in through the phone. This would give you another way to listen to it. But as I mentioned before, We will be recording this, so it will be available on our website within the week if you do have any issues. As well as in the chat pod, you can put issues in, and Dana, who works at our WTI office, will be trying to manage those requests coming in. So for today's presenter, we have Nick Ward. He is the director for the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. His background is in cognitive and social psychology to understand how perceptions and social factors influence behavior. The center examines the role of culture in decision-making processes and ways to transform culture to sustain safe and healthy behavior. And we've been very lucky to work with Nick throughout our entire run at the Rural Safety Center. He's done several of our safety culture projects for us, as well as many of the different webinars that we have done on this topic. And today he's going to be talking to us about traffic safety messaging. So once you've completed today's webinar, you'll have information on the design of effective traffic safety messages based on an understanding of traffic safety culture. To achieve this goal, you will learn to identify different forms of traffic safety messaging, to explore the role of message frame, and to recognize possible negative reactants to messages. I do want to mention that the advertisements that are used in this free webinar are being used for educational purposes only. These advertisements are unmodified and are copyrighted and or trademarked by their respective owners, and we have listed them on the slides. For any of you that are possibly losing audio, again, please try and call in on the 866 number. And I do want to mention as well that we will have a few videos shown today. If for some reason they are coming in too slow or buffering for you, we have also added the YouTube links underneath them so that you can watch them at another time. And again, those YouTube links can also be found in the handouts in the bottom left-hand corner, so you can download that PDF and you'll have all of those links available to you. So at this point, I'm going to ask Nick to go ahead and start our webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let me just pause and make sure you can hear me.
Yep, loud and clear.
Great. I hope you're all safe and healthy and taking care of yourself and those you love as we get through this chaotic period of time. Today I want to talk to you about traffic safety messaging, particularly through the lens of traffic safety culture, talk about some of the approaches that we're taking here at the center, and share those with you so we can think more deeply about the kind of messages we create, why we're creating them, and how we can create more effective messaging as part of our traffic safety campaigns. So first of all, I want to start talking about different forms of traffic safety messaging and look at these different forms of messaging in terms of a model of traffic safety culture. But let's first start talking about traffic safety messaging in general. So what do we mean by a traffic safety message? Well, a traffic safety message is often part of a road safety campaign. And the link here and the cover on the left is from a European project that did an exhaustive examination of road safety campaigns. And the first thing they did is come up with a definition of what we mean by a road safety campaign. And essentially, the key element of this definition is that we're trying to change people's beliefs and therefore their behavior as it relates to traffic safety. So when we're talking about traffic safety messaging, we're really trying to change people's beliefs so that their behavior changes. Many of us work in the area developing traffic safety campaigns and traffic safety messages in particular. And at this point in the webinar, I just want us to stop and think and ask ourselves, are we being busy or are we being effective? I think we can all agree we're being very busy in terms of trying to understand and generate traffic safety messages, but are we really being effective with those messages? Are we getting the results we want? Do we know if we're getting the results we want from these messages? Let's start with this example, Got Milk. I'm sure many of you remember the Got Milk ads. I suspect many of you remember them very fondly. They're very memorable. They were very popular. Some of them were cute, interesting, engaging. A very popular campaign developed to try and increase milk consumption in the U.S. and I'm sure you remember seeing these in the past too. So very popular, very prominent ad campaign, and the only problem was it totally failed. It was totally ineffective in increasing milk consumption in the U.S. So its main purpose, to increase milk use, it failed, although it was highly memorable and highly popular, which leads us to an important conversation point. Don't mistake popularity with effectiveness. We may like our messages. The intended audience might remember them and like them and have positive things to say about it too, but that does not mean it's going to actually change behavior and be effective. So we need to dig a bit deeper into ensuring our messages are not only popular and memorable, but also effective in terms of their intended goals, and to have that data to demonstrate that our efforts have been successful. Let's move on to another example. This is a often cited example of the Meth campaign here in Montana, a long-running campaign showing disturbing images of meth use with an effort to try and stop meth consumption amongst Montana youth. And this too is a very popular campaign, so popular that the White House adopted it as a model for how to do preventative public health messaging. And partly because of that, it was adopted by many states despite the absence of any evidence that it worked. And in fact, when you look at the effect of this campaign on meth use, it was statistically insignificant. There's no evidence that this campaign did anything to affect the behavior of meth use. So that's similar to the Got Milk example, a popular campaign, one even endorsed by the government, did not have any effective results. In fact, it had some undesirable results. Looking into the reports on this particular campaign, there's evidence that this campaign actually increased reported acceptability of using meth and reduced the perceived danger of using drugs. So not only in this case was the message non-effective, one could also argue where there were some undesirable side effects of this particular message. Again, this encourages us to think not about the popularity of or memorability of an ad, but to look at what the data says in terms of its effectiveness, and also to do a broad evaluation of our messages to make sure there are no unintended consequences. So what do we mean by effective? If we're making an argument here that we need to be more effective in our messages, what do we mean by effective? Well, there's many different criteria for what we can mean by effective. The first is fidelity. To what extent did our road safety campaign be reproduced in the environment as it was expected to be? Was it reproduced exactly as designed? Exposure. Did our intended audience be exposed to the traffic safety messages? Did the radio and news ads and posters get out where they were expected, and were they exposed to the intended audience? And yes, salience. Were they noticed? Were they memorable? That's an important component of effectiveness too. If you expose a group to a message and they don't notice it, aren't able to remember it, it's not going to be effective. But salience and memory alone is not enough to be effective. Essentially, we need to know whether our message changed the beliefs we were hoping to change. That's an important part of the logic of how messaging changes behavior. And so in turn, if we change the beliefs, did the behaviors change too that we believe were tied to those beliefs? And ultimately, the bottom line is, did this change in behavior change the outcome that we were trying to support? Did crashes go down, for example? So those are the ways we can look at effectiveness, and these are ways that we should start thinking about evaluating our road safety campaigns and our traffic safety messaging in particular, in terms of these particular criteria. And what I want to do with the rest of this webinar is talk about some success factors. What are some factors related to the design of traffic safety messages that will help us be more effective. And those are listed over here. And I'll cover each of these in more detail as we move forward. But is our messaging based on a theory of behavior change? Do our messages actually include the behavior we want? Do we help people feel more capable of engaging in the behavior we want? And of course, we should probably talk about the issue of what emotion are we using in our messaging. Are we using fear? Are we using humor? Are we using something else like hope? Because that has important effects on the effectiveness of the messaging. Then we'll talk about the frame, how we frame our messaging and what effects that may have, not only on the messages we choose to use, but also how they're received by our audiences. And then finally, how can we avoid reactance? Reactance where our intended audience refuses to listen or maybe even do the exact opposite of what we're asking in our messaging. How can we create messages that are more likely to be heard and less likely to have pushback from our intended audiences? So let's move through these success factors one by one. Let's talk about theory first. Going back to that European project evaluating road safety campaigns, one of its main conclusions is that one of the main predictors of success for a road safety campaign and its messaging is if it was based on a theoretical model which linked beliefs to behavior. In the absence of such models, the messages tended to be less effective. So what does that mean in terms of application to designing messages? Well, the first question is, we should perhaps discuss the fundamental question, can you change behavior? I think we all think we can, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this, but there's a nuance to this question. We're not actually changing the behavior, we're changing the influences on that behavior, particularly behaviors that we call deliberate, ones that people plan to do or are willing to do. There's some influence on that planning and willingness, and it's the influence factors that we're trying to change rather than the behavior directly. But by changing the influence, we should be able to change the behavior. And in the case of traffic safety culture, we focus on a group's shared belief system as being the influence on behavior. The shared beliefs within a family or in a workplace or a school or a group of friends, that shared belief system from a traffic safety culture point of view is what's influencing their behavior. So in creating traffic safety messages, we're creating message content intended to challenge and change the belief systems that define the traffic safety culture of the group so that the group's behavior changes. And in a way, this is our fundamental theory of how we go about changing behavior. More specifically, this is our logic. We call this our logic model. It expresses the rational reasoning for why we're doing what we're doing, the logic that if we have the right content to change the relevant parts of the belief system, we should get the change in behavior we want. So let's go back to this example of the Montana Meth campaign. Why didn't it work? And why, in fact, were there negative side effects? Well, what was the underlying premise of this particular campaign? What was its goal? If you look at its literature, its goal was to stigmatize use, to make meth use socially unacceptable. That was the goal. That was the leverage point it was trying to use in its campaign. The problem was that particular theory was flawed. And it was flawed because if you look at social acceptability of meth use at the time they developed this campaign, 98% already strongly disapproved. So it was hard for them to get any more movement in making meth use more stigmatized when 98% already agreed it was strongly disapproved socially. So their starting premise may have been flawed in this case. More importantly, let's look at the theory behind this, this campaign. What theory was it using? We can also ask the question, what behavior was it referring to? If we go back to the image, looking at that poster, what behavior is being encouraged, what behavior is being identified as the one to change? Is it clear what this message is asking you to do or not to do? One can infer they're trying to ask you to not use meth, but that's an inference. It's not directly evident from this message what behavior they're trying to change. Less evident is what theory they are using. And there are a bunch of theories out there that can help guide us with our messaging. This is an example of one model. It's called the health belief model. And it basically says the amount of threat we perceive in a particular public health condition links to the probability of us trying to do something to be healthier. Our sense of ability or capability, our sense of control, our sense of efficacy relates to how much we're likely to engage in that health-promoting behavior. If there are cues in the environment as to when we should engage that health-promoting behavior, we're more likely to. If there are high perceived benefits and low perceived costs of engaging in the health-promoting behavior, we're likely to do it. There are some modifying variables like age and gender. And threat itself is a joint factor of the perceived seriousness of the health condition and one's susceptibility to that condition. So if we think it's dangerous and we think we're likely to be affected by it, we perceive a threat. So thinking back to the meth campaign, what was it trying to do in terms of this particular model? Well, the only thing it was trying to do was to emphasize the seriousness of using meth. It did not address any other parts of this model, so perhaps it's not surprising then that it had no effect on the intended behavior. For example, it didn't show you what you should do. It didn't show the benefits of not using meth. It didn't include what cues to look for in the environment for when you should engage the behavior. And again, there's still some ambiguity about what behavior they were focusing on. But one could argue this was an ineffective message because it was not based on a theory and only addressed part of a theory, one component of a theory, and therefore without addressing all the components of the theory, is unlikely to get the behavior you want. So this is an example of the absence of a theory-based approach to messaging that may explain why this particular campaign was not as effective as hoped. Now, moving to traffic safety culture and the work we do in the center, this is our model. This is what we just simply call a behavioral model. And we keep adding to it as we learn more about new theories of behavior and behavior choice, willingness and intention. But this is our basic model. And it basically says that our belief system, which is all this to the right, is guided by our values. What's important to us, what we prioritize, determines what we pay attention into our world, what we remember, what we think about, what we make decisions about. So our values sort of put a box around what's relevant for us to acquire as a belief system. We have beliefs about the consequences of behavior, which leads to our attitudes. We have beliefs about what's normal and acceptable in our social groups, which leads to perceived norms, and also this idea of a prototypical image. This is what we think the person is like who typically does the behavior. Do they have positive traits or negative traits? And we also have beliefs about our ability to engage the behavior and affect our environment to make change, which relates to our perceived control. All these beliefs impact our willingness and intention to engage in behavior. All these beliefs that form our belief system influence our decisions to engage in either risky behavior or protective behavior. And our whole effort is to measure how these different beliefs influence willingness and intention, that is the decision, to engage in a risky or protective behavior. And we try and create messaging and do other experiences for our audiences to create the willingness and intention to engage in protective, safe behavior and not engage in the risky behavior. So at this point, having seen the model that we use in our center, I can talk about some examples of messaging, forms of messaging that can be used through the lens of traffic safety culture to change behavior in road users, to reduce risky behavior and increase safe or protective behavior. Here we can talk about safe behaviors being the opposite of risky behavior, but we can also talk about protective behaviors where we're trying to protect the safety of other road users, not just ourselves. So let's start with values. How can we use values in this model to help create messaging and road safety campaigns to promote safety and protective behaviors? Well, we can start by trying to understand what values are important to people and how those values relate to the behavior we're trying to grow. And this uses a marketing technique called value laddering. Another technique that's similar is motivational interviewing. But essentially, you try and query why a person does something and keep asking why until you get to this ultimate value that is the reason, the goal of the behavior. So imagine we're talking to a group of people who do the behavior we want, which is buckling up, and we're trying to come up with messaging to help others buckle up. So you buckle up. Yes, why do you buckle up? Because I want to survive the crash. Why do you want to survive the crash? Because it's important that I'm still around. Well, why is it important that you're still around? Because I have a family to take care of. We eventually get to this high-level value where why no longer makes sense. It is many of these values are almost universal. They're deeply ingrained. We may not always be conscious of them, but once we identify and attach to them, they become highly motivating. So in this case, we can see through this value ladder that the behavior of buckling up ultimately supports the value of taking care of family, being around to take care of your kids or your partners. And from that, we can create messaging. And here's an example about Idaho, where they sort of link the buckling up to take care of those you love, the family, friends, etc. Connecting the behavior we want, buckling up, to the value that's important to nearly all people, taking care of family and people you love. So that's an example of messaging using this model that links the values that are important to the behavior we want in the road safety campaign. Let's move through the rest of the model. Those of you interested can use the links to go to the more detailed examples of these particular campaigns I'm talking about. But this is an example coming out of Australia. It targeted a specific culture, a specific group. It was young males in Australia, and the specific behavior was speeding. They did research to find out what beliefs supported the teen male's decision to speed, and they found one of those beliefs to be they believed that young women thought it was masculine and sexy if they sped. So they had a positive attitude about speeding because they believed women found it attractive. Actual research as to what the women thought was the exact opposite. They thought it was stupid, unsexy, unmasculine, idiotic, and they came up with this campaign where young women would do a hand gesture which connotated the exact opposite of sexy and masculine to challenge the beliefs, the mistaken beliefs of the young teen male. And you can see from the link here, if you go to it, there's some results showing that teen male speeding actually went down as a result of this campaign. So this campaign is not just cute and memorable, even funny, is actually based on a model which links beliefs and attitudes to behavior, and recognizing that these young males had misperceived information in their environment and therefore had false beliefs. So the campaign tried to correct the beliefs, because the true beliefs that women don't like this behavior is not only true, it also supports an attitude that would reduce speeding, which is beneficial to the road safety campaign. We can also do the same thing looking at normative beliefs, what we think different people in our social groups think is acceptable and what is typical. This is an example using the prototypical image. Again, that is the image, the characteristics that we identify with someone who always does this behavior. And if we can associate positive traits with doing the behavior, we're more likely to do it. So this is a campaign that was done through Montana for local tribal communities where they used rodeo heroes in that community, heroes that had very positive associated images and characteristics around them that were perceived positively and idolized by their local communities, because rodeo and being a good horse rider is a very valued aspect of that community. They identified and linked these rodeo champions to wearing a seatbelt, so that the seatbelt wearing as an image had more positive attributes associated with it, and therefore the behavior itself became more appealing and people were more willing to engage in wearing seatbelts to sort of emulate these champions, their heroes. The classic example of this is using social norms, in this case what most people do. This is a campaign did a long time ago, challenging the perception that most people in Montana don't wear their seatbelt, and that some people use that for justification why they don't wear their seatbelt, but the truth is most people do wear their seatbelt. So again, another misperception. Misperceptions often lead to risky behaviors, and therefore often messaging is intended to tell the truth, because the truth is positive in the sense that it in fact supports safe outcomes. So this is an example of using the social norm messaging frame to show what the true norm is, because that norm is positive and supports safety, and therefore we hope that people would recognize that norm and do the same behavior themselves because they identify with this group, namely Montanans. But as you can see so far, there are many other ways of using traffic safety culture models to produce messaging other than just social norming. The last one I want to talk about here is perceived control, the belief that we are able to control our situations, the belief in our ability to engage in the behavior. This is a New Zealand campaign called Bloody Legend. And this is interesting because here you have an example of cultural language. Bloody in New Zealand and Australia, and in fact some other English countries, bloody means great or awesome. So it's a very positive adjective. So being an awesome legend in this case, because this young kid at a party stopped a friend from driving when he was drunk. And the commercial's all about this kid worrying about whether he can intervene to ask his friend to stop. What was his friend's thing called the social pressure if they think he's stupid. And he goes through with it and realizes that everybody's happy he did it. And it sort of demonstrates that we do have control over helping other people be safe. So another example of traffic safety messaging tied to a model, a theoretical model, of how perceptions of ability to control and engage behavior can support the desired behavior. In this case, protective behavior, helping someone else be safe. So we just finished talking about perceived control. Another word for that is efficacy or self-efficacy, the belief that we can engage in a behavior. And as the last example showed, it's really important in our traffic safety messaging to help people feel they can do the behavior we want. But all too often, our traffic safety messages don't show the behavior we want. It only shows the behavior we don't want. And to be more effective in our messaging, we need to show concern about the behavior we don't want, but show the behavior we do want so people can see that it's easy to do, it's possible for them to do it, and it does produce the desired outcome of greater safety. Now to illustrate this point, I hope we're going to show you a couple of videos. The one on the left is from the French Traffic Safety Authority. It's a speeding commercial. It is a very graphic speeding commercial. It shows the awful consequences of speeding. It shows in vivid detail what we don't want, and that is speeding. And then when we come back, we'll watch a second video, which I'll talk about more before we start it. Dana, if you want to go ahead and show the French one first.
Yep. Sure. And I do want to point out one more time as well that this is being recorded, so if these do not come across clearly, the recording will be available on our website within a week, as well as the links are available in that PDF in the handouts down in the bottom left-hand corner, just in case you have problems with buffering.
Répétons toujours les états.
Nick?
Oops, sorry, thank you. So that example clearly demonstrates the behavior we don't want, speeding. It shows the awful consequences of speeding quite clearly, but that's all it talks about is the behavior we don't want. What about the behavior we do want? People to slow down and to show that it's possible and to show that it's beneficial. The example that we'll now show is from New Zealand, and it shows, again, a perhaps less graphic video. But what's different about this video, it does show speeding, but it also shows someone not speeding and how that is possible and leads to a much more desirable outcome. Hopefully, Dana, we can try this and not have the feedback.
Yeah, if you could make sure that you mute yourself, and Jamie
Yep.
as well. I think you may be the only three. All right, let's give it a try.
So welcome back. We still had some technical problems with echo. I don't know whether you want to try playing them without sound this next time. But so that last example, you did see the message about why speeding is undesirable, but you also saw someone not speeding to show people through this message that it is possible not to speed, to grow the sense of self-efficacy, and show the outcome to be more positive. So there's a purpose and a reason why we want you to slow down. The message on the right, from this point of view, is a better design message and more likely to be effective because it actually not only communicates the hazard associated with speeding, it also gives the audience a sense of self-efficacy that they can slow down, and if they do, they will get a more desirable outcome. Both of these, however, especially the first one, really played on fear, the first one in particular. Very much fear-based in the sense that it was trying to scare you because it showed you one of the worst possible scenarios involving speeding. And that's a common approach in traffic safety and other public health issues, is the philosophy that trying to scare people into doing what we want. And I want to just sort of move on and talk about that and see if that's really an effective approach. So when we decide to use an emotion within a road safety message, we're assuming that that emotion will act as a motivator for change, and in particular, sustained change. We will always avoid that behavior, or we will always engage in that behavior because we want to avoid a particular emotion or experience a different emotion. Here we have two examples I want to show. The first is another fear-based ad around seatbelts. And Dana, we can probably play without sound. I think it speaks for itself. But let's watch that one first, and then we'll come back and talk about the second one.
Okay.
So I think we're back. You can see from that example, very much fear-based. In fact, playing on fear linked to taking care of family, so a double whammy there. Very graphic, very fear-based, showing you one of the most awful consequences of not wearing a seatbelt. And that's the whole premise behind that one, is to fear people into always wearing their seatbelt to avoid that awful, if not uncommon, outcome. Notice, too, in this message, there's nothing about self-efficacy. It's not showing the behavior we do want. It's not showing anyone putting on their seatbelt. It's not showing how this consequence would not have happened if there was a seatbelt on. So this one is fear-based and also missing the self-efficacy component. Let's now go over to this other example from Essex, England, that has a totally different tone toward the same message of wearing a seatbelt, and then we'll come back and discuss that. So clearly two different strategies to communicate the same safety message to wear your seatbelt. And I'm sure as you sit there where you are watching this, you felt very differently between the two. And hopefully you actually felt more positive and hopeful after watching the second one. And the second one has a number of important attributes that differentiate it from the first one. The first is that the family is key to this message too, but it's part of the message in a much more positive, supporting way than a fear-based loss way. The family is part of this message in two ways. One, it's a metaphor for wearing a seatbelt, and it's also the reason for wearing a seatbelt. As we remember back with the Idaho example, wearing a seatbelt so we survive crashes to be there for our families. And by showing the metaphor of wearing a seatbelt, this particular safety message connects to self-efficacy. It shows what the behavior we want. We want people to wear seatbelts. The other message is only showing what we don't want. And in this case, the Embrace Life message also shows that it's effective. There was no negative consequences of the simulated crash that took place because they're wearing the seatbelt. So this also shows the efficacy of wearing a seatbelt, that it can stop physical harm in a crash. Now, I do want you to notice that you can have hope, in this case, hope in the sense that it shows a way to avoid the negative outcome, and it gives sort of motivation or will to make that action, to be around for your family. That's what we mean by hope, showing a solution and engaging motivation to partake in that solution. But it did not ignore the fact that not wearing a seatbelt is bad and dangerous and can have bad outcomes. It still showed the crash with what looked like broken glass and stuff. It still didn't shy away from the seriousness of having a crash or the seriousness of having a crash without a seatbelt. It just did it in a much more relevant way to the overall message and avoided unnecessary blood and guts. So I would invite you to sort of think about the hope frame as a way of putting messages in, not only because it's often more palatable, but the hope frame shows the behavior we want and creates the motivation to do that behavior. Let's talk more about fear, and in particular within our center, why we avoid fear-based campaigns. There's lots of, it's true people may remember a fear-based campaign, but as we already discussed in relation to the Meth campaign and the Got Milk campaign, remembering a campaign and even thinking it's popular doesn't mean it's effective. The effectiveness of a campaign is not by how well it's remembered, it's by how well it gets us to our goal. So why do fear campaigns not always get us where we want to be? Well, first is what you're showing could be aversive and people are not going to process it completely. In fact, they may think what you're showing is so far away from their reality they disassociate from it and won't think it will happen to them, which breaks that link in the behavioral health model. If people aren't thinking it can happen to them, they're not going to pay attention to the message or consider the behavior you're advocating for. It can also create a sense of helplessness. If you show something awful and don't show how to avoid it, people may feel helpless. They don't have any sense of control or efficacy over it. So you have a negative response in that sense. Stigmatizing, you can also stigmatize the people in the message itself. So here's another example from the Meth campaign showing a mother who's being beaten by one of her children, a daughter, who is on meth to get money from her, and that basically stigmatizes the child on meth, and it may even stigmatize the mother for having a daughter on meth. And there's some evidence to show that after this campaign, families felt less inclined to ask for help because they were embarrassed by having a child addicted to meth, another unintended side effect. Moving even on, another problem with fear-based, if you think back to old black and white scary movies, and now compare them to what we see today, fear is one of those things that we acclimatize to. If you scare me today, you got to do something even worse tomorrow. And you get this sort of progressive escalation of fear-based messages. And that also happened in the Meth campaign. And they ended up with this one, which was rejected by the local community. There were news articles how local communities phoned in and demanded that these billboards be taken down because it violated the social moral principles of the community. It was deemed so fearful it was offensive. So at some point you're going to run out of fear before you start offending people, in which case your entire message and the campaign will be rejected. Which reminds me, having just looked at the Montana Meth campaign last week, none of these campaigns are available on their website anymore, or any mention of them. They've been erased. So fear, I think I've hit this point home, is not necessarily the best way to go, and in our center we advocate for a frame of hope, which still shows concern for the situation, but shows the behavior we want and creates motivation for people to take that path to the safer choice. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jamie, for some thought questions.
Thank you so much. And we do have quite a few questions coming in on the chat pod on the left, but if you do have any other ones, please go ahead and type those in. For those of you who may have lost audio, again, you can call in on the 866 number at the top left-hand of your screen. If you lost visuals for any reason, you can also download those from the bottom left-hand corner in the handouts, and again, we will provide the recording. We realize that there is a lot of taxing on the internet going on right now and that some people may be having issues. But we are going to move on to our poll questions, and our very first one for you guys is using social norms is the only way to change traffic safety culture using messaging, true or false? And then for those of you who've been joining us for our monthly webinars, we've started a new challenge. We'll have one at each section and a final one at the end. This challenge is, from this section of the webinar, what is one action item you'd consider implementing in your jurisdiction? If you'd please write it down where you are, but then if you'd like, you can please feel free to share it in this poll pod as well. We'd love to see your answers. And we'll give everyone just a few minutes to go ahead and fill out those questions. In the meantime, Nick, I'm going to start with some of the pieces going on in the chat pod for you. Our very first one was not a question, but it was more of a statement. I'm sorry, the chat pod is very small right now, so I'm trying to be able to read it. Okay, so the very first one was, the message needs to be mindful of various cultures over regions and ethnicities, socioeconomics, and age groups. Would you like to respond to that at all, Nick?
Yes, very true. Excellent point. And in fact, we're going to talk about that when we move on to the frame section of this talk. You need to create your messages that use the language and reflect the values of the cultures that you're addressing. Very true.
Another one for you says, maybe the goal of the Meth campaign was to keep the 98% non-usage as opposed to thinking you can increase it above 98%. Somehow our culture got to 98% non-acceptance, and this ad campaign could be considered part of getting and maintaining the 98% non-acceptance.
That may be, but it's 98% before the campaign started. I think one of the things, reading the evaluations of that campaign that they believe had the biggest effect was the increase in enforcement, and that the awareness of the increased enforcement, which was happening before and after the campaign, certainly may have led to that rise in the unacceptability.
And another comment that came in as well is that messaging that might work in one area of the country might not work in another.
Another fantastic point, yes. Tied to the first question about addressing safety messages to particular cultures. These aren't necessarily drag and drop messages. You can't just pull them off the shelf and throw them over every fence you want. You always need to consider the local culture, the language, the values of that culture to make sure that your messaging is still relevant. And in fact, you still want to make sure that the model that you're using to create your messaging works in different cultures. So for some cultures, attitudes might be the most important driver of behavior, whether in another culture it might be perceived norms. So there's very much a need to address the process of creating messages in a group-by-group, audience-by-audience, culture-by-culture basis, not just rely on pulling things off the shelf and sending them out as if they apply to every culture and every group.
The next one, again, is another comment versus a question. It says, in the U.S., we also have to work at mitigating the commercials for luxury cars speeding through residential roadways in downtown areas.
No, that's another fantastic point. In fact, in other talks, I use those commercials as ways of suggesting we have a culture that favors speeding and doesn't see it as being a safety issue in the general population. Otherwise, car companies would not be pandering to it. But I agree, it's a very questionable approach to market a car demonstrating it has the opportunity to speed when we know speed is a risk factor in fatal crashes. It's like advertising cigarettes as having extra nicotine and extra tar. I agree, it's very questionable.
Okay, we're going to do two more, and then we will save the rest of them for the next period. But one of the questions that came in was, why do we have these commercials, or why don't we have these kind of commercials in the U.S., referring to the videos that you showed?
Boy, great questions. I don't know. I think partly it's to do with some sort of general high-level cultural factors of the U.S. I don't know whether, and it might have to do with some of the decision makers higher up that don't think these examples would be palpable, acceptable. But I really think it comes down to that we're probably stuck in a particular box where we think a certain approach works, and we're a little reluctant to move out and risk something new. So I think, hopefully conversations like this will give people the encouragement and the confidence to try new things outside of the box, more like we're seeing in other countries. And I think once people start doing that and evaluate them carefully to show they work, I think we'll get a lot of positive momentum, and we'll probably step away from our old frames and into the new ones.
So this last one is, again, another comment, and I'm just going to read this out. You've talked about this in the presentation, and then again throughout these comments you've mentioned this too, and then we'll move on to answering the poll question. The comment was, as was said earlier, you must determine what it is that a person values. In some cases, an element of fear works because that is what society as a whole are used to and have adapted to. And there is a difference between gore and suspense and fear.
Yes, and I think we might be almost getting down to semantics at this point, but it's certainly true that we naturally respond to avoiding negative outcomes. I mean, we're just wired that way. So I guess it comes down to what we mean by fear and versus concern. And we're more comfortable using the word concern because it acknowledges the negative outcome. It still tries to attach to this natural instinct to avoid negative outcomes. But it's a softer form of fear, I guess is the best way of saying it. It still motivates avoiding the situation. It still generates attention and concern about the situation, but it doesn't trigger into these extreme fear reactions which can lead to people shutting off and rejecting the message. So the balance needs to be right, which is why we use the word concern.
So it does look like from all of our challenge questions that we have quite a few things in here that are action items that people would consider implementing in their jurisdiction, and they look great to me. Hope is the number one answer that was up there showing. Benefits of bike ped projects, education of new drivers, focusing on changing attitudes and not behaviors. So all of these answers are great, and we appreciate you taking the time to fill those in. Nick, if you wouldn't mind addressing the poll question, and then we'll move on to the second part just to make sure you have enough time to finish your presentation. And we'll take some more questions at the next question and answer period.
Yes, great. So historically and traditionally, social norms was the sort of primary way of directing culture-based messaging. But through our center, we've expanded that to include many more components. And you'll notice the model I introduced that we use in our center, the behavioral model, it certainly does include social norms, but it has many other components because it integrates several different behavioral models from psychology and sociology. So there are other ways to address this other than social norms. And in many cases, it's these other ways that are the important effective agents. It's not always social norms that's the driving force. It may be one of these other avenues such as perceived control or attitudes or the prototypical image. So we have many more opportunities to change beliefs and change behavior by using a broader model than just social norms. So now moving on to this notion of frame. What do we mean by frame, and why is our frame important to the messages that we choose to use and how they're perceived? So when we talk about a message frame, we basically mean what are the values and assumptions that are implicit in the message? What values is our message trying to support, and what are the background assumptions we have walking into making this message? So we may have values around, what's the purpose of the traffic safety system? Well, that's to promote safety. We may have certain beliefs and assumptions going into creating a message. One might be that people respond to fear, and that becomes your frame. You decide, that's your assumption, you decide to frame messages around fear. So thinking about what your values are and what your assumptions are, we're not always aware of them, but it's sometimes good to sit back, think about them, discuss them, and challenge them, because values and assumptions together produce a frame. And our frame directs our attention to what problems we pay attention to, which ones we don't, how we interpret situations, and most importantly, it biases our solutions. We tend to pick messages that fit our frame. And part of this conversation is not only for you to think about what your frame is, but also to think, what is the frame of your audience? What are the values and assumptions of your audience? Because, as we'll talk about in a bit, to create credible messages, we need to have trust with our audience, and that trust comes from having similar values and assumptions. So if we present messages that have the same frame, the same values and assumptions as our audience, we're more likely to be trusted and the message is more credible. Yes, we can challenge assumptions, especially the example I talked about where people believe things that are actually false. It's important that we correct the assumptions, but it's important that we communicate with values that are the same values as our audience so that we are seen as a trusted source of communication, a credible source of information. So I mentioned your frame biases your messages. You tend to, if you create a message in your own frame, it will be fitting into your frame and perhaps not your audience frame. Your messages reveal your frame. The audiences may be able to infer your frame, what your values are from your message. And if it conflicts with their values, you may have some conflict. And if you don't declare a frame, the audience will impose one, and perhaps it's a frame that will render your message not credible. So, the example of a politician coming into a town hall meeting and talking about the need to put a bypass through, the audience is going to see this person as an outsider who's only valuing the sort of economics at the higher state level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and make his message not credible. Whereas if he came in with a different frame saying, I in fact live in the area, I think this would help us, community, getting our agricultural products out into the market better, blah, blah, blah. So it's good to be explicit about your frame so that people don't impose one on your message and render it not credible. And as I mentioned, sharing a common frame increases trust. If we are communicating about the same set of values with our audience, they're more likely to trust us and perceive our information as credible. So let's have an interactive component. Here are two columns, A and B. Under each of these letters, A and B, are a number of statements that reflect different frames. They imply different values. They imply different assumptions or beliefs. And I want you to read down column A and column B and just listen to your gut and your heart and your head and see which ones sound like you or resonate with you or represent messaging you've already used in your particular organization. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, we'll come back to this, but let's see why these frames matter. And my point here is that depending on which frame you take, you're going to come up with a different messaging or a different strategy toward road safety. So here's two examples of the statements we already heard. Your responsibility is to be safe versus our responsibility to be safe. So we have an individual frame. Each person's responsible for themselves. In a collective frame, let's work together to make each other safe. And depending which frame you would choose to adopt, which represents your values and beliefs, you'd come up with two different campaigns. On the left, you drive, you tax, you pay. Very much an individual-based frame. The one on the right is an interesting campaign out in New Zealand about protective behavior and cell phone use in the car. And here you have people in the car that when the driver's phone rings and the driver goes to reach for the phone on the console, the passenger reaches out and holds the driver's hand. As much to say, remember in the car too, put me first, drive safely, drive without the phone. Very much a message based on this notion of a collective frame where we're trying to help each other be safe. A deficient frame versus a strength frame. The deficient frame is humans are stupid. We got to do stuff to replace the human. They're just fallible and stupid. We got to get them out of the system and give them smart cars. versus a strengths frame, also by a car company, that recognizes that humans are hugely adaptive and versatile and problem solvers and improvisers. And in many cases, you need that to overcome a potentially critical incident on the roadway. A compliance frame versus a decision frame. Compliance frame goes along with the statement that drivers need to be penalized to behave safely. The whole message strategy behind there is to make people compliant with the laws, because they are not willing to be safe themselves. They have to comply with the law, so fines and ticketing and enforcement. Whereas the example we saw of the Embrace Life seatbelt one is slightly different, or very different. It says people want to be safe, they can be safe, they just need to reconnect to their values to show them why being safe is important. You don't need enforcement if people are behaving in ways they recognize align with the values that are important to them. I shouldn't say you don't need enforcement, but you also need people to recognize to recognize the relevance of the behavior you're asking for to their own personal values, so they're self-motivated to do that behavior too, not just intrinsically motivated to avoid fines. Fear frame and hope frame, we've covered that already. The example of the French ad, all fear-based, speeding kills people. Versus the hope frame showing the self-efficacy of slowing down, and that can save lives. Different frame entirely. Stigmatizing frame versus a behavioral frame. This is a subtle one. Commercial from Thailand, drunks cause fatal crashes. Stigmatizing people who have drinking problems, when in fact it's drunk driving. It's the behavior of driving that causes fatal crashes. And again, the one on the right, attaching to this value of wanting to protect family and friends. So having gone through the examples, walk through these statements again. Now that you've seen some of the consequences or some of the potential strategies that are most likely linked to these statements, are you still happy with those frames than when you first looked at them? Or are you moving over to a different version of the statement? And this discussion of frames is important because the way you frame a message causes a reaction in the audience, not just around the particular behavior you're trying to change, but other consequences too, other reactions too. So suppose you're working with a community and you're coming up with a message. Which column, A or B, is going to create more positive energy, more motivation, more trust in you as a practitioner, more engagement from your community to create a safety campaign based on these messages? And I would argue that on this side, it's sort of a negative, almost depressing, hopeless sense to these statements, whereas on this side it's much more positive, much more encouraging, much more hopeful, and that positive energy and hope creates more motivation, trust, and engagement. So the other reason why we want to think about our messaging and our frame is because choosing the right frame, especially one that's sort of hopeful, motivating, can create the energy and engagement you need from your coalitions to be more effective. I mean, it's hard to imagine people coming together to work on a traffic safety project if they all think humans are stupid. It's much more probable to have effective innovation, sustained effort from an ideology that humans are powerful. So Jim, do you want me to just finish off the last part and then come to the questions? Oh, no. Okay, never mind.
No, I think we can stop here for a minute. For anyone who does have additional questions, I saw a few more coming in. If you want to put those over on the chat pod on the left, we'll take a few minutes here to answer some questions and also ask you guys a poll. So our question for you is, which of the following is not true? Your frame biases your message. Values plus fear equals frame. Audience will impose a frame. Sharing a frame increases trust. Or I don't know, I don't remember. And again, it's which of the following is not true. And then again, we have our challenge question for you guys from this section of the webinar. What's one action item you'd consider implementing in your jurisdiction? Again, if you want to write it down where you are, that's fine. And then if you'd like to share that with us in the poll pod, we'd love to see your answers there as well. And we are taking a look at all these challenge questions after the webinars as well for our own information. So we'll give everyone a few minutes to do those. And in the meantime, I'll go back to the questions. So there is, your first one again, Nick, was more of a comment than a question, and that was that the very common superpowered car or truck ads by auto manufacturers are extremely counterproductive to safety messaging. They're using the method shown here to show the desirability of excessive power and speed capability. So very similar to what you had said earlier.
Agreed.
There was a question about getting a high-quality version of the Sussex ad that someone would like to use, and Jay did put in a YouTube link in there into the chat pod for that. There also, again, each of those YouTube videos that we showed, we did put the link in the PowerPoint, which can be downloaded out of the handouts in the bottom left-hand corner. If that's still not high quality enough for you, Rob, if you'd like to contact me separately at the Safety Center, and we can see if we can find one for you. The next question for you is, how do you measure the effectiveness? The number of hits on social media does not change behavior.
How do you measure effectiveness? If we go back, if we remember that earlier slide where I listed effectiveness, we essentially want to come up with a measure for each of those. So come up with a measure of how well the roadway safety strategy was implemented relative to how it was intended. That can be done by going out and seeing how the community has actually implemented it and comparing it to the design specs. The exposure, that comes from sort of what you're talking about, measuring how often the message went out in social media, how often it appeared on the radio, how often it appeared in the newspapers and so forth. The salience, that's simply doing a survey and asking people to recall, have you seen this message? How often you think you've seen this message? Sort of tapping into memory that way. In the center, we also measure the other components. We actually do a before and after survey of beliefs around the behavior, so we actually try and measure whether beliefs changed in relationship to the exposure before and after the exposure, and we often relate that to also a control site that never had the exposure. And we can also collect with our partners, state DOTs and communities, data about the behavior, for example, measurements of speed on the road, and outcomes, for example, reported crashes. So there's ways to tap into all those layers of effectiveness, and by doing all of that, one has a very comprehensive assessment of the effect of the campaign, and it helps verify the underlying logic that supported that campaign.
Nick, we have two questions that came in for you that are very similar, so I'm going to read them both together because I assume you'll want to address them at the same time. And that is, do you have specific ideas on how to reach young people without seeming lame or trite? And the second one is, can you recommend a resource for identifying the values of 16 to 25-year-olds?
Great question. I invite you to contact our center separately. We've done a lot of work with younger groups, and we can connect you to some of that work that we've done. But essentially, when we do messaging for the younger groups, we're very cognizant that we're working with their beliefs and their language, and we use their images. So it's basically them talking to themselves. It's one way of dealing with it. But you need to get into their culture and understand what's relevant in their culture so that you use the right type of language and the right kind of leverages to make your message relevant and motivating. I don't know of anything specific to the values of the young group you're talking about. There's a lot of published literature on and standard surveys of what are deemed to be universal values, and I would suspect that young people would still possess these same values. They just may prioritize them differently than someone who's older. So you could use the same kind of standard survey with a young group, and it's still worth using those same values because they're more or less universal, but they may just possess them or prioritize them to a different degree than an older group might. That'd be a good starting point.
Perfect, thank you. And for anyone who does want to reach out to Nick afterwards, our very last slide will have contact information for Nick and the Center of Health and Safety Culture. But you may also, as always, contact us at the National Center for Rural Road Safety, and we'll put you in touch with him as well. Nick, at this point, I have gone ahead and closed the poll question and broadcast that for you if you'd like to address that.
Yes, the correct answer here is they're all correct except the second one, values and fear equals frame. It's values and assumptions equals frame. Just want to touch on that too. One of the people online mentioned they were going to focus on presenting their frame to their audiences. I just want to touch on that again as to why that's important. It's important to sort of make sure your values align with the values of your audience to grow trust, but it's also sometimes useful to talk about your assumptions because those assumptions may not be accurate in relation to the community you're working with, just like communities and groups may not have accurate perceptions about their own culture. And an important side effect or secondary benefit of sharing your assumptions is you could then engage in a conversation with your community audience to see if your assumptions are correct. You may have an assumption that's false, in which case your community can inform you of that, and through that dialogue you can learn the truth about that particular issue, and you benefit from that conversation to have a more accurate set of assumptions and a frame better aligned to your audience. All right, finally moving on. Despite our best efforts to be effective in our messaging, we're not always effective. But this is not because we haven't used a good theory or we've picked an inappropriate frame. It's just something about the nature of our audience in relation to the type of message we've used. So I want to talk about this notion of reactance, and that comes from recognizing that sometimes our messages don't work, especially for certain subgroups which are resistant to change and maintain the behavior we're trying to change. You know, the holdout, whatever it is, 8% of people in a state, hypothetically, that don't wear seatbelts. They may be resistant to our standard seatbelt messaging. These groups that we target may not listen. And in fact, these groups may do the exact opposite of what we're asking in our messaging. Before I move on, does anybody find any of the words on this slide odd or uncomfortable? There's a word in here that implies my frame. Target. The groups we target. It implies a frame that we have a problem that we need to eradicate. There's groups that are the problem, and we're here to fix that problem. We need to target them to fix them, as it were. That may not sit well with some groups had I used that particular terminology. It implies the groups are an adversary almost. So a better word might be to serve. And that is a much more cooperative type frame where we, as the safety practitioners, who perhaps have the greater knowledge and skills, are here to help communities become safer and shift their culture. It's our responsibility and role as practitioners to help society and our communities be safer. So just as you use your wording in day-to-day conversations, especially with the communities you work with, see if you're using any words that imply a frame that you weren't aware of, but that your audience might pick up on. Anyway, moving back to what we mean by reactance. The actual term is called psychological reactance. It's a psychological reactance to a message, to a command, to an instruction. And it's defined as a negative response to a perceived threat against a perceived freedom. So we have, some people may react, may demonstrate psychological reactance when the message you are communicating puts them in a negative state of mind because they think you're threatening their ability to do something, a freedom they currently have. And the more freedoms your message touches on, the more likely you'll have strong reactants. How important those freedoms are to the audience, if your message is attacking an important freedom, you're more likely to get reactants. And the extent and scope of the consequences of that freedom being limited also increases reactants. So as we design messages, we also need to keep in mind what is the possible reactance that could come from this message, particularly for certain subgroups that may be resistant to losing their perceived freedom to engage in that behavior. And currently in the center, we're working on a project to look more closely at this notion of psychological reactance, to understand how it impacts the effectiveness of traffic safety messaging. And the goal of this project is to understand which frames and which types of words are more likely to result in reactance than others. And the goal of this project is to come up with some guidelines to suggest certain frames and certain wording, certain attributes of the message that would be effective by avoiding a lot of reactance. So one of the simplest ways of thinking about this is you can create messages that have low threat, that try and target a behavior without threatening strongly the freedom to commit the behavior, versus messaging about a behavior that have a high threat to remove the freedom to commit that behavior. So as an example for texting, a low threat might be try not to text and drive, you could arrive alive. It's addressing the desire to change texting behavior while driving, but it's not directly threatening person's choice or freedom to text while drive. Contrast that with this message, arrive alive, never text and drive. That's a much higher threat message around the same type of behavior, directly challenging the freedom to text and drive. And we would expect, certainly for some groups, to have more reactance, more rejection of the latter particular message. So this is part of the work we're doing currently, is to understand what dimensions of messages lead to reactance and to provide guidance on how to phrase our messages in ways that are effective, being based on theoretical models, but are framed in a way that they support acceptance rather than rejection. Here's two more examples. The one on the right, every trip, buckle up every time, a high threat message, directly challenging the freedom to choose, versus a DUI one, which is more reflective, low threat, still wanting to change people's behavior about DUI, but not directly challenging the freedom for it. So I think this is an important next step as we look to developing more effective roadway safety campaigns and traffic safety messages. Certainly need to consider the other success factors that we spoke about: theory, effect, self-efficacy, and frame. But we also need to look into the details of the attributes of the messaging to create ones that are going to be accepted and embraced and listened to challenge beliefs rather than rejected, avoided, and ignored because they're perceived to take away individual rights of freedom. And with that, I should say yes, and going back to fear and hope, along these lines, fears tend to be inherently threat-based, whereas hope overcomes threat and is less likely to result in reactance. Another endorsement for why we believe the hope frame is more effective and sustainable. And now I will stop. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nick. So we do have one more question for our audience, and then I have a few questions left. We'll take just those couple that are left that were already in the chat pod as we're coming close to our time. Our first question for our audience is: a psychological reactance is a negative response to a perceived threat against our perceived fill-in-the-blank. Would that fill-in-the-blank be frame, opinion, freedom, value, or I don't know, I don't remember? And again, we would challenge you in this third section, from this section of the webinar, what's one action item you'd consider implementing in your jurisdiction? One of the questions that came in for you, Nick, was what do you think about the messages that end in "it's the law"?
Can you repeat that one? You broke up a little bit.
Sure. Yep. So there are some messages that end in "it's the law," and what do you think about those types of messages?
Interesting question. I don't have a qualified answer to that. What I will say is there's some interesting work on the role of laws and what they can signify and how they can be used. If it's true that laws reflect what the majority of people in a group believe and want, saying it's the law can be another way of saying this is what our culture accepts or expects. So slightly dodging the answer, but to the extent that that sentiment is saying it's what our society wants and supports and expects, that's one thing. Saying it's the law and do it just out of compliance, that may be more likely to trigger the reactance component.
Okay, perfect. We have another question that came in was, are audiences and location variables to framing your message?
Certainly the audiences are. As it goes back to the different cultures, we want to make sure that we're reflecting the values that are important to the audience we're talking to. So that's certainly the case. I don't know, I can't think of examples where the environment itself, whether you're in a town hall versus a school, whether that makes a difference or not. I can't think of an example of that right now.
Perfect. And then we did have a question that came in on speed and educating that, but we did have a lot of the audience members go ahead and share examples in the chat pod for how they've dealt with that. So I will let everyone know that if you do want to scroll through the chat pod, or again when we post the recording of this and want to take a look through the chat pod, there were a lot of the audience itself who were giving great feedback on all of the questions that came in, especially that speed one. So in order to wrap up on time, I am going to ask you, Nick, if you would go ahead and address the last poll question, and then we'll do our final couple of slides.
Yes, the question is freedom. The answer is we have psychological reactance when a message is perceived to threaten, remove what we believe to be our own choice or freedom.
I'm just going to jump back over here to the presentation. In today's webinar, we hope that you guys have learned to identify different forms of traffic safety messages, to explore the role of the message frame, and to recognize possible negative reactance to messages. We do want to let you know that the National Center for Rural Road Safety's April webinar will be us co-sponsoring the webinar that will happen in conjunction with the Everyday Counts Forward team, which is the roadway departure team. It will be held on April 16th from 11 to 12:30 Mountain or 1 to 2:30 Eastern, which would be our normal time slot. To register for that, the link is on the slide right now. Again, it's also available in the handouts. We will post it to our website as well, but it will be a different registration than normal for us. It will not be through our system. As always, we do have over 50 webinars that are recorded and archived on our website that you can watch at any time. We do have the final challenge question up on the right-hand side right now. So from this webinar, of all of those action items that you wrote before, which one would you consider implementing in your jurisdiction as the most important? And then I do want to mention again that we are at this point still planning our Rural Safety Summit number 3. It is the Rural Road to Zero. We intend for it to happen at the end of September in Kansas City, Missouri. As with everyone else, we're watching what's unfolding and deciding whether or not we will continue with that, but please keep on the lookout for information about that summit. And lastly, I will leave you with Nick's email address as well as the ways to get in touch with me at the National Center for Rural Road Safety if you do have any additional questions from today's webinar. And Nick, we want to thank you one more time for taking the time out of your day to present today. I heard tons of comments in the chat pod, read a lot of them that said this was one of the best webinars in quite a while. So thank you so much for presenting today.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and healthy.